Well, the recognition of Daniel Ama was the high point of the 4th National Summit on Diminishing Corruption in the Public Sector, while the theme was corruption and the education sector. In his remarks, President Muhammadu Buhari blamed striking education sector workers for being complicit in the corruption that undermines the nation's educational system. Well, Professor Attahiru Jega, a former president of the Academic Staff Union of Universities and former Vice Chancellor Bayero University, Kano, delivered the keynote address.
This year's summit will mirror how corruption undermines education policies, investments, and create an unfriendly learning environment for our youth. Incessant strikes, especially by unions in the tertiary education, often imply that the government is grossly underfunding education. But I must say that corruption in the education system, from basic level to tertiary level, has been undermining our investment in the sector. And those who go on prolonged strikes on flimsy reasons are no less complicit.
And from both primary to tertiary educational institutions, the types and the evidence and the incidences of corrupt practices have increased remarkably. And these are not limited to the following. Of course, bribery is key, theft, direct theft is key, diversion of funds as well as equipment in educational institutions is another factor. Nepotism and favoritism in appointments and promotion of teachers, including not just teachers, all the staff, embezzlement of funds by officials, extortion of contractors and suppliers by management staff, absenteeism by both management staff and the teaching and other staff, extortion of money from students and parents either for admission or for grades or even for issuance of transcripts, certificate racketeering, exploitation of students, whether sexually or in many other ways. All these are incidences of corruption which abound, which are documented, and they cut across the entire education system. The type of corruption which is most pervasive and prevalent at the primary and secondary levels is what Transparency International calls petty corruption, and the World Bank calls it quiet corruption.
And the former president of the Academic Staff Union of Universities, who is also a former vice chancellor of the Bayero University, Kano, and erstwhile chairman of INEC, the Independent National Electoral Commission, Professor Attahiru Jega, joins us now in the studio. You wear so many caps. Thank you so much for joining us on the news tonight.
Now I wear only one.
Well, great.
Yeah. Thank you for having me on your program.
Thank you so much for coming. You had a lot to say earlier on in the day about corruption and the education system, generally the public service. Specifically for the tertiary institution, as a former ASUU boss and a former vice chancellor, how serious is this? Because you talked about measures being put in place, yet corruption persists. How bad is it in the tertiary institution, and what are we doing wrong?
It's very bad. And as you rightly know, in general, corruption is also very bad in our country, particularly in the public sector, mostly in the federal public sector, because that's where there is documentation and evidence. But a lot of it also happens at the state and at the local government levels, perhaps with more devastating impact. So I think nobody would sit and say there is no corruption in the tertiary education sector, or even in the education sector generally, you know, because they are part and parcel of the larger Nigerian society. So definitely there is corruption in the university system, and corruption needs to be fought wherever it is. I can tell you that when I was president of ASUU and we were able to negotiate the agreement in 1992 with the Babangida military government, we were all euphoric you know, that now that a lot of issues relating to condition of service and condition of work had been addressed in the agreement, we were now going to turn our searchlight inwards, so that all these issues about either certificate racketeering or absenteeism or lack of ethical conduct in the way in which lecturers related with the students, ASUU will now make it the major agenda of its fight. But we signed that agreement in September 1992. By January 1993, we had a new Minister of Education, Nwabweze, who now came and said that agreement was an agreement of imperfect obligation, that government will not honor it. Yeah. And then that put ASUU and the university system into another round of crisis related to enforcement of agreements which have been legitimately signed into. And I suspect, because I am still in the university system, I suspect that this issue of a government signing agreement with a union and then turning around, you know, to put it aside, it's one of the major reasons that divert the attention of the academic staff union of universities from focusing its energies and attention into addressing the local challenges, because they are out there trying to struggle to protect an agreement that has already been signed.
So in other words, what you're saying is the university system itself is weakened in such a way that it cannot address internal domestic issues. With the distraction that you're talking about, I mean, ASUU has been on strike.
Absolutely, I think you are right. Yes.
Right. So how exactly do you now strengthen the university system in a way that they can address these issues frontally?
You see, when you have a situation, or rather when the situation has been left to be so bad that in fact many people who have opportunities, very qualified lecturers, are leaving the system and either going abroad or into other well-paying jobs in the public sector, you know, then obviously those who want to protect the system, who want to remain in the system and make it a career, will struggle to ensure that there are remarkable improvements in the condition of work and in the condition of service. And regrettably, that struggle, you know, to get government to pay attention to the university system and to improve conditions of work and conditions of service tends to sap all the energy, rather than focusing that energy inwards in order to catalyze internal
and my point, the point I'm trying to make is, how do you now strengthen the university system in a way that it can, you know, do its own house cleaning before going out?
I believe personally that the way to address this thing is really for government to look carefully at the issues that are on the table for the negotiation with the academic staff union of universities. To be honest and to be very frank with you, I believe personally, I mean, and I have been there, you know, what we see now is similar to what we saw in 1988 to 1990, when the Babangida regime at that time had people who were telling them that the ASUU people are only troublemakers, they are extremists, they don't mean well for the country. And therefore, whatever they said, no matter the genuineness of the demands that they put on the table, these are not looked at. They are just looked at from the perspective of people who are troublemakers, who are trying to cause trouble for us. And this, remember, ASUU is probably one of the strongest unions of intellectuals in this country. You know, issues they put on the table for discussion and negotiation are well thought out. Regrettably, government representation in negotiations does not take these issues with the seriousness it deserves. So what happens? Negotiations will go on, government team will not pay attention or cannot counter the arguments that ASUU present. At the end of it, they agree to an agreement, they now take it to government, and government will say this agreement is unrealistic. You know, so those are some of the challenges. Okay. And unfortunately right now, and I want to say it here because I have this opportunity, the Minister of Labor is not helping matters. You know, he has turned this into a personal quarrel between him and the Minister of Education on the one hand, and between himself and the Academic Staff Union on the other. Right. And while many other people are trying to find a way of addressing this situation so that students can go back to school and the ASUU can go back to work, he is busy creating challenges. He now took the matter to the industrial court. The industrial court also has appealed. Now, today, he now registered 2 unions, and he's trying to proscribe the Academic Staff Union of Universities. If this is allowed by this government, I think this is a recipe for disaster, and it may really create more problems than it can solve on this matter of strike in the universities.
I'm glad that you went there, because I want to ask you, you know, your thoughts on the way the president has handled this situation so far. The ministers are carrying out this duty. However, they remain in their posts at the, you know, pleasure of the president. How would you say the president has handled this? Because today he spoke about those who engage in incessant strike as culprits of corruption, who undermine government's investment in the education sector. The president had also mentioned today about funding, saying the government cannot do it alone, and stakeholders are not looking into the internally generated funds in the university, where he says corruption may be happening, and that's what we should look at as well. So when the president speaks like this, what do you think?
Well, I will think that those who are advising Mr. President, because the president of a country has to rely on advisors, either his ministers or other advisors. On this particular matter, I think the president is not being advised well. That's my personal opinion on this matter. You know, because look, this issue of internally generated revenue, you know, I know from the example of my own university, because I still teach at Bayero University when we are not on strike, that is, you know. I know in Bayero University, the entire revenue generated cannot even pay 6 months diesel, you know, for light. Because the overhead that is given to the universities, it's very, very small. As I speak with you now, regrettably, and this is part of the confusion in government policy, as I speak with you now, because staff are on strike, they have even stopped sending overhead to the universities. They are not paying overhead to the universities. They are not even paying the salaries of vice chancellors and other management staff of the university who are actually working, who have been working, because they are management staff. They are not union people. So how do you pay for diesel? How do you pay for the cleaning of services? If you open the universities today, because they have withheld overhead, even the classrooms will not be sufficiently cleaned for students to come back, not to talk of hostels and the other services. You know, so there is, I think, frankly, Mr. President needs to be properly advised. Unfortunately, the perception many of us have, and I do have that perception, there seems to be either a silent or an open quarrel between the Minister of Education and the Minister of Labor. The Minister of Labor thinks this is just a strike and I am supposed to handle it as a Minister of Labor. Whereas the Minister of Education wants to address it because as a Minister of Education, he has the responsibility of schools and how schools are run, particularly those owned and operated by the federal government. You know, so that kind of quarrel creates a situation in which we can rightly assume that the president is either getting conflicting information on this matter or is being misadvised. So
now you just said, you know, the creation of another, you know, different other unions within us is a recipe for disaster. What are the implications? Because it does seem to a lot of people that this may be an attempt to weaken ASUU. And in whose interest
there is no doubt about that the perception of people like the Minister of Labor is that ASUU is a very strong union, ASUU is a troublemaker, ASUU is holding the country to ransom, and the only thing is to break it. No, but remember 1992, we were under military rule. Our union was even proscribed. And yet, because at a point we had a responsible Minister of Education, the late Fafungwa, Professor Fafungwa, people like him were able to persuade General Babangida to recognize that what ASUU was doing, their language may sound intemperate, they may sound aggressive, but if you put that aside and look at the issues they put on the table, these are in the larger long-term interest of the country. Okay. And that got into Babangida to even agree, that's a military dictator, to even agree and negotiate with ASUU representatives when it was banned, and to have an agreement that everybody in the country felt was a good agreement that could reverse the process. But unfortunately, as I said, an interim government was established under late Shonekan. Mwabweze became the minister in charge of education, and reversed the entire thing. And we've been in that spiral of strikes and counter.
So what would be the way forward?
Forgive me, but I do have two questions for you.
To be honest, the way forward is to recognize by whatever global indices or parameters that are used to compare the seriousness that a government takes with regards to education. Nigeria is far, far below. Okay, so two questions, and specifically, because at the crux of this matter, of this lingering industrial action, is money. If you're looking at the payment platform or revitalization of funds or, condition of service, is money. How do we improve funding for the education sector? President Muhammad Buhari against today said, the government alone cannot do it. That's one. Like I said, forgive me. The second one is the former cap you wear. As the former INEC boss, the campaign seasons have started for 2023. Are you impressed with the preparation and activities you have seen so far? I do not want to join issues with Mr. President, but what is very, very clear to me is that a government that takes education serious will find ways and means of addressing the crisis in the tertiary education sector in particular, because many of the universities are federal government-owned universities. I think that is very, very important. Yes, government may not be able to continue to sustain funding of university education, but let government do its best. Right now, if you use all the indices, government is not doing its best. There are two key indices which I mentioned today in my lecture. There are two indices that are used to measure the priority that a government gives to education. That is one, expenditure per pupil. You divide the total budget allocation either to the institution or to the education sector generally with the number of either pupils or students in that sector. How much does it translate per capita? That is used globally to measure how countries give their priority to education. If you do that in Nigeria and compare it with most African countries, not to talk about globally, we rank at the bottom. The other one is the percentage of the budget that is appropriated for education. And if you do that, you will also find that Nigeria is far at the bottom. Now, recently they are arguing, and those who are arguing this are putting it into the Mr. President's speech. They've now argued that when you are computing the percentage of funding in budget for education, is not just at the federal level. You have to consider the state and the other things. Fine. Let them identify. There are about 30 or so federal countries in the world. Let them check the budgetary appropriation to education as a percentage of the total budget in only federal countries, and compare it to that of Nigeria, where are still very, very low at the bottom. So what is the argument about the states is spending money? In fact, I have argued the money that most states in this country, there are a few exemplary states that are putting money in the education sector and are ensuring that it goes to the right things. Yes. But many of the states, I can argue, that not up to 40% of the budgeted funds are actually spent on education. They
on the
steal
elections,
it.
very quickly,
We'll
sir.
have to
On the elections.
let you go.
Now, what was the question on election?
Preparations for the 2023 elections, very briefly.
Yes, very briefly. I think INEC should be commended for the good work they are doing, scaling up the use of technology, training and retraining of staff, and ensuring that there are remarkable improvements in terms of lifting the bar for the 2023
So you're confident
elections.
in this INEC?
I believe that INEC is doing its best under very difficult circumstances, but it is not INEC alone that brings successful, credible election. Our politicians have to change their mentality. For example, right now they are in the process of appointing new recs, you know, and you can see how political interests and the intrigues have come into it, and many of the recommended people are actually partisan people, recommended by either serving governors or former governors. If those kinds of people are allowed to get into INEC, they may compromise whatever good work that is being done. So care needs to be taken in that regard.
Thank you so much, Attahiru Jega, a man with so many casts, former Vice Chancellor, Attahiru University, of course, former Chairman of INEC. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.